From streets to stalls, the history and evolution of hawking and hawker centers in Singapore. So, welcome everyone to episode 92 of Teh Tarik with Walid, and I am delighted to have Ryan Kueh. I think it's an apt surname that he has. He just recently wrote this book. I'm delighted to have him on for episode 92 of Teh Tarik with Walid. So we will discuss this book because he talked about hawking and hawker centers as being part of the social and political fabric. So what do hawker centers have to do with politics? So let's get him on. Hi Ryan.
Hi. Hi, properly. Can you hear
Hello.
me?
Yes, I hear you well. You can hear me as well?
Oh, good.
Yeah, okay. All right. So firstly, congratulations. So this was recently published. When was it out?
2 weeks ago, about 17 August. Yeah,
Okay.
quite
So I just
recent.
read this today. Really fascinating book. So tell us briefly first, before we take the conversation
Yeah.
further, tell us the key arguments of your book. What did you find writing this book?
So I think for me, there are three key arguments. One is that I think hawkers really reflect the a specific time, either social or economic conditions of a specific time, and Singapore's history, and I think throughout the world as well. Two is that hawker centers was primarily designed as a method of control, right? I think a lot of us have this conception that hawker centers were intentional and was quite cultural and political, but I think most realize that throughout history that wasn't really the case, right? The political and cultural and social elements are sort of layered on afterwards, right? I think hawker centers were really first designed to be public amenities that public health amenities, if you so will, right? And last but not least is the idea that hawker centers are important to us politically and culturally as well. I think a lot of Singaporeans and Singaporean lives has been shaped around the hawker center, whether they know it or not, or at least for those staying in public housing. And I think the idea was to bring to fore some of those nuances or some of those things that we take for granted, I think including myself, and to, I think, have a better appreciation of the hawker culture and hawker centers around us.
Wow, fascinating stuff. So before I take you up on those points,
Mm.
I just wanted to say the list of people who endorse your book is the who's who of Singapore society. Madam Halima Yaakob, Dr. Eileen Wong, Professor Tommy Koh, Professor Wang Gungwu, Professor Lily Kong, Professor Chua Beng Huat. My God. Like, how do
Yeah.
you get all of them to endorse?
Uh,
Who are you? Like,
no. To be honest, I can assure everyone that's watching that I am absolutely nobody. My friend called it the best core email success of all time. I think every one of them was almost like a core email. Whoever
wow.
was on there also, I think there was another long list of rejections. I think most of them are like either professors of year and years before, but still, I think a majority of them are core emails lah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's discuss the points that you mentioned, especially we'll
Mm.
discuss points two and three, especially, right? So you said hawker centers are instruments of control. What do you mean?
So I think the hawker center instruments of control must be understood historically, right? Is the idea that in the past, I think especially before our independence, hawker centers are like sprawling on the streets. They're mostly itinerant, mostly informal. I think if you go to some of the developing countries around, most of the street hawkers, right? I think that was what Singapore used to be like, and it was quite pervasive. I think Singapore had a lot of street hawkers around, especially in the CBD area, and they would cluster around the streets. Either they would be in push carts or on baskets, right? But I think in the 1970s, the government introduced the idea of like permanent hawker centers, and this is a little bit different from like hawker shelters, which I think we can discuss later. But the idea of hawker centers was to introduce some sense of to control two things. I think one is the hygiene, the public hygiene, to provide spaces for them to cook cleanly, to have running water, to have washing basins, to have ventilation fans, like very basic infrastructure that very oftentimes is not, I think, appreciated enough. But also to get them off the streets, right? Because you can imagine if there's a lot of unlicensed hawkers on the streets, it could block up roads. It could cause pedestrian and like motor congestion. And I think it was sort of a central space to sort of agglomerate these hawkers and provide them a space to operate out of. So I think that was what I meant when it is designed as a method of control. It's really to instill some sense of discipline. I think another way to understand it is to instill some sense of formalization, right? To bring the hawker trade from informal to formal. Yeah.
Okay. So, what about now? So that was the
Mm.
evolution, right? How do you see hawker centers? Is it still an instrument of control?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think hawker centers are still an instrument of control. You can see how NEA sort of is quite hawkish when it comes to like cleanliness of hawker centers. The idea that you have to retain your trays yourself now because you want to keep the hawker centers clean for everybody. Um, so yes, I do think that idea of control, especially in relation to health and hygiene, is still very pervasive in the government's frame of mind. Um, and I think that will continue to be so for quite some time to continue.
Okay. Nice insert there, by the way. NEA is very hawkish about it, so I'm sure you didn't plan that at all. Yeah, so that's very interesting because we always see, and one of the things that was evident, like from the first chapter, right? And
Mm,
I'm really thankful that you brought this up in your book and here as well. One thing that is really evident is that a lot of these things, they are not unconscious, right? They are
mm,
conscious, and we like to think of these spaces as neutral
mm,
when actually they are not. They are designed in a particular way to achieve particular purposes, right? And even
mm,
something as maybe benign as hawker centers, right? Actually, there's a lot of thought uh,
mm.
that goes into all of that, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for putting. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, did I go somewhere or yeah, okay.
That's okay, that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So okay, so the political and cultural significance, can
Yeah.
you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I think the political, I think first off the cultural. So I think political and cultural, there's two sort of temporal dimensions to it, right? I think I'll start with the cultural first, since I think most of us conceive hawker centers as a cultural element now. I think hawker centers as a cultural element is quite recent, right? Um, it only came about in, I think, 2017. I think that was when the first inclinations of hawker centers as a culture really came about. Um, and that really first began when, like, I think the government was planning for SG50, right? They wanted something to sort of, I guess, mark SG50.
Right.
And NHB went around the grassroots to get people to vote for what they thought would be a good uh, culture or representation of Singapore, right? So I think across different focus group discussions and different engagements with the grassroots, people actually voted for hawker centers, right? Across like Thai, across like different other like Chinese, Malay, Indian cultures. I think everybody unanimously seems to coalesce on the idea that hawker culture was very uniquely Singaporean. And then that was how they chose hawker culture to be nominated to UNESCO. Right. I think a lot of people don't realize that, it's, I think also most Singaporeans tend to assume that, oh, government picked this and then government thinks that this is the best of Singaporeans and they elected or they nominated hawker centers or hawker culture. But in this case, it was quite grassroots, so it's quite organic, so to say. Right. And I think that's important because it seems to suggest that most Singaporeans organically conceive of hawker culture and hawker centers as important to them. And this wasn't really intentional by the government, right? This cultural social element. Um, and this was so, and this links to the second point I'm trying to make, is that this wasn't always the point. This wasn't always the case, right? In the past, hawkers or before hawker centers, hawkers was seen as almost like a legitimacy barometer for the incumbent, right? Especially during the colonial era, hawkers was always very antagonistic as a labor group. right? Because they were informal, they were always dirty, they were messy, they caused problems for the administration. And it was only after hawker centers did these sort of issues sort of dissipate across time, right? And I think hawkers usually, if you see across other countries as well, they are quite a sticky problem, right? Especially when the administration lacks teeth. What happens is that when you try to uh, when you try to regulate hawkers, right, they will just run away and then they come back, right? I think Singapore last time is the case, right?
Yeah.
You know, they will shout like, "Oh, mata lai liao, tiku lai liao," right? And then they will all run and then they'll come back and then do the same thing, right? So I think it was always a big political taunt for most of the incumbents in Singapore's history. And it was only really after independence did, I guess, the Lee Kuan Yew generation solve this issue, right? Yeah, I think I'll stop there first.
Yeah, no, thank you, thank you. So, hawkers are a point of legitimacy. So now it's not the case anymore, or do you see today like hawker centers or hawkers or hawking in general being
Yeah.
a site of resistance or contestation in any
It's
way?
like, I think yes. I think
How
100%.
how so?
It's a little bit different
Yeah,
now, because you can see. I think one very obvious way to see is how every GE, the MPs will go down into the hawker center, and the thing is, it's quite interesting because they're the only ones that goes down in like shirt and pants to the hawker center, right? Okay, and I think it's quite intentional, right? You want to be seen in the hawker center amongst the people. Nobody dresses that formally to the hawker center anyways, right? But during election times, I think even during like non-election times, it's quite important for the MPs to walk the ground, get a sensing, hear what is the chit chat amongst the residents. So I think that's one thing, right? It's the idea that hawker centers have become the political space, right? Actually, the key political space, even more so than the community centers, which are supposedly purposely built political
yeah.
community spaces, right?
I guess
Um,
sorry Ryan. I
yeah,
guess
yeah,
because since it's already built for that, so there's a lot of skepticism or just ambivalence towards it,
yeah,
right? On the part, whereas hawkers
correct,
is not meant to be that way, right?
correct,
So that's why it becomes even more as an important site for this.
correct. Right. And that's quite interesting, right? Because then it sort of lends the notion to the idea that the hawker centers are a neutral space, so to say,
Yeah,
or at least the residents see
right.
as a neutral space. But it really isn't also because like so that allows it to be a conduit for like whatever the environment is, right? And in Singapore's case, it's quite a socially engineered environment. Because the HDB has racial quotas, and because hawker centers are public amenity and they have to serve a racially quota environment, then by extension, it has to be some version of
Yeah.
political, right? And this has other ramifications like how it sort of racially equalized the hawking trade also, right? I think most people don't realize that the hawking trade used to be dominated by Chinese and Indian, I think the immigrant population rather, right? But only after hawker centers did they have the, I guess, instrument to racially equalize the hawking trade in Singapore.
Yeah. So that was one of the questions I had as well. So
Mm.
let's discuss that because I must say I never thought I would see the myth of the lazy native being quoted in a book about hawker centers. But
Yeah,
I mean you did very well. So
yeah.
could you explain a little
Thank you, thank you.
what that means and how is it related to your observations, your theory? Yeah.
So I think the way that I saw it was, so I guess as a brief background or introduction to the Live the Lazy Native, I think for some of the listeners, it was the idea that I think the Malays or the natives in most British colonial empires were seen as lazy because they didn't want to partake in like colonial labor, right? But conversely, because you have the Chinese and Indian immigrants, and they didn't have that sort of support structure, they didn't have that sort of agricultural subsistence living as the Malays had. The Chinese and Indian immigrants were solely reliant on like colonial labor as a means of living,
Right.
right? And that is also partially why I think most of them took to hawking, right? Because, for example, because hawking is a very popular transitory job, when they couldn't find a job with the British, especially for blue collar labor, then you just hawk lah during the meantime. right? I can find a job at the warehouse, then I will go and like sell something simple until I find a job somewhere, right? Um, so I think in the same vein, like the Malays also didn't really have that need to participate. So I guess they didn't have that circumstance that forced them into hawking as well.
Right.
Um, and therefore, I think when they did the census in the 1950s, they realized that most of the hawkers, I think almost 80 to 90% were Chinese and Indians. Right? I think absolute numbers wise, Chinese had the most number of hawkers, but relative to their ethnic background, the Indians had the most number of
Oh, okay.
most
So
popular hawkers.
disproportionate number of
Yeah,
Indians.
yeah, disproportionate number of Indians.
Okay.
So when the hawker centers came about, then because the HDB is racially quoted, right, then they have to serve the racial quotas, lah, right? And that's why I think each hawker center strives to be as I think a close proxy to the HDBs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And you even talked about, sorry, you even talked about the questions that were asked in Parliament about halal food and
Yeah.
Indian food in hawkers. Yeah. I guess so. So your point is it became a necessity, is it? Since the quotas were there, it
Mm.
became a necessity, which was of course introduced in the 1980s, that the hawker centers must also necessarily be multiracial, just because of demand and supply.
Correct. Yeah. I think that's the idea. I think you put it quite nicely. That it was a necessity because of like the economic conditions that the government created themselves, I guess.
Right, right, right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things when I was thinking about the hawker center
Mm.
being a site of resistance, right, or contestation, is the fact that
Mm.
that is the place where you did mention it being an equalizer,
Mm.
but I think more than an equalizer is also the place where um, people buy the most affordable food, right?
Mm.
The most
Yep.
affordable takeout food in
Yep.
Singapore. So the moment the prices increase, and the
Mm.
prices have
Yeah.
increased
Yeah.
quite significantly, right?
Yeah.
Is it fair for me to say that that's a good barometer of what's going to happen, as well as a good sensing of how people feel?
Yeah. Yeah. I think affordable food is always a very touchy topic, a very hot button issue with with the Singaporeans. And I do think it's quite interesting to see the dynamics play out also, right? Because once in a while you see like the news of like, oh, this hawker store rentals hit like record high,
Yeah,
right? The
yeah,
Marine Parade, the $10,000
right.
one, and then they're like, oh, the government, oh, why is the rent price so high, right? Right. And then NEA will always try to come out and say, oh, the rent prices are actually not that high. It's a bit lower than what I expect. And then this tussle goes on and on. But I guess it speaks to the idea that I think affordable food is a very key political issue. I think both the government and the people are very mindful of, are very conscious of that. Um, but the way I see it is, I think the issue with seeing that way is that I think the government does in fact subsidize. I think from the statistics show that the government does subsidize a lot of the conditions necessary for affordable food, right? I think, but the government doesn't directly subsidize or mandate affordable food per se. I think they're starting to go there a little bit with
Mm,
the budget meals, but in the past, I think that social element has always been more of incentivizing the appropriate conditions for affordable food, right? They didn't
okay.
want to sort of mandate a margin for the hawkers, so to say. And I think it will be a key issue in the next general election. I definitely do think like this, I guess hawker prices, hawker rental prices, food prices, inflation will indeed be a key issue. And I do think the pressure is mounting on the government to sort of, I guess, moderate this sentiment, so to say, going
I
forward.
couldn't
Yeah.
agree more. I think even for people who actually can afford, right? Like it's almost a
Mm,
psychological thing when they go to hawker centers and the
mm,
prices are much higher than before.
mm,
So almost a
mm,
psychological reminder that inflation, and it's the most stark
mm.
reminder, even though inflation affects everything, but when you go to a hawker center where you expect prices
Yeah.
to be the lowest,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So it's a psychological thing, I think. So yes, thank you, thank you. So in your in your research, did you have to eat a lot of hawker food
In
throughout?
my research, not for this book. I think hopefully for the next one that I'm planning for, yes. But this book was more historical in nature. I didn't have to eat a lot, but I had to talk to a lot of, I think, older generation people.
Okay.
All right, and I think one example was my grandma, and I think that really elucidated to the how I guess hawking can be the intergenerational bridge also. Right. So I really connected with my grandma over like this, I think when I was writing this book, right? Because I was asking her how the hawker landscape has changed across the years. And she shared a lot of key stories about like her favorite hawker when she was growing up in the kampong village, and then she moved here and, when she moved to Sembawang, where's her favorite hawker? When she moved here, moved there, where's her favorite hawker? Um, so I didn't have to eat a lot of food, but yes, I think talking to different people, I think made me realize I guess, the social power of hawker cultures,
Mm.
so to say.
What do you mean social power of hawker culture?
Like, I think it's a great way for people to connect, like intergenerationally, right? I never felt my grandma. I think most Asian parents and grandparents, they don't share that much about their own personal stories and memories. But I think when I was talking to my grandmother about the changes in hawker culture and hawker centers, it's something that they will always share very fondly. And I think that gives me a glimpse into how her life was like in the past, right? So she actually grew up in this old pig village called Basumpa in Sembawang up north. And this is one of the last few remaining pig villages, and she would share how her favorite hawker was actually this Malay satay stall right opposite a mosque that was at the front of her pig village farm, right? And quite interesting times, right? You have the mosque right beside the pig village,
Right,
and I
right,
think that also speaks to some kind of multiculturalism back then.
right.
And I
Free
think
HDB quotas.
yeah, free HDB quotas. And then yeah, I don't know. I think when she shared that kind of story so fondly, you know, uh, I think it's just very different. I think for me that was very powerful. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, okay. So you said you're gonna write a next book on hawkers as
Mm.
well. Okay, what
Uh,
is that gonna be?
so I think I think I'm playing with some stuff. Either it's on the evolution of Nanyang Chinese food. How the Chinese food is different from the China Chinese food, or
Right.
maybe it's like more hawker related stuff. I'm also thinking of toying with something about hawker centrality. So more modern sociological, the idea of how hawker centers have changed Singaporean lives. Like for example, how HDB kitchens, right? I think it was Robbie Go who was writing about this, how HDB kitchens are actually getting smaller and smaller after
Yeah.
HDB officers realize that people don't use the kitchens and they eat out at hawker centers. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Okay, okay. Wow,
So either one lah.
fascinating stuff. So I think both topics are fascinating, right? The first one
Mm.
would be it speaks to a larger point about the evolution of Chinese identity, right? The
Mm.
Singaporean Chinese identity, right?
Mm.
So all the best with that. Yeah. So
Okay.
you know why I was asking you, because I wanted to ask you where would you say are the best hawker centers in Singapore, but since
Mm.
you didn't embark on that yet, so we'll leave that for another. But it's probably somewhere in the east. Yeah.
Oh, no, 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 no. I'm a best side person. I'm sorry, man. Absolutely
I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah. So if we look at hawker centers, right, and you mentioned that it's a site of elections, right?
Mm.
Uh, how have you studied? Have you talked to people about how people receive politicians at hawker centers? If it's supposed to be an equalizing space, right?
Mm.
Because I can imagine, first of all, when I go there to eat. I'm not necessarily there to talk to politicians.
Mm.
Uh, so, uh, so already that will affect probably how I relate to them. And
Mm.
secondly, it's not a space where it's a community center where,
Mm.
or at a middle people session where it's the MP's home
Yeah.
ground, right?
Yeah.
For this one, the resident's home ground, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know. Have you thought about it? I was thinking about it when I was reading your book. Is there
Yeah.
a shift in power dynamics there?
I think to some extent, yes, but I think the power dynamics still, although there's a shift, I think the power dynamic still biases the politician, so to say, right? I can't say that I have spoken to many people and understand what their reactions are, but I think I have been a victim of that, right? I have been eating at a at a hawker center, a coffee shop. So I stay in Taman Jurong, and sometimes my
Sorry to hear.
parents. It's quite far from CBD lah. I think that I can attest, but going to NUS was quite close. So I think that. Well, yeah, sorry. I was saying going to at Taman Jurong back then when President Taman was still the MP of the ward, right? It's quite random because you'll be having a dinner and usually they'll drop by unannounced, right? I think for the most residents, it's unannounced, right? It's just every regular Sunday and then suddenly the deputy prime minister is there and then he's like going around shaking his hand. And I think most people receive him warmly. I think that's what I observed. They are pleasantly surprised. And they're like, oh, you're President Taman and DPM Taman and I think that perhaps speaks to the idea that how well liked that incumbent in that ward is, right? But I think I think President Taman is a very
he's an
it's an exceptional case, lah, right? I can imagine in other wards it might not be so warmly received, or in some other wards I have heard of like friends or like my grandparents and their friends generation. They said, "Oh, I didn't even know this person was my MP until like I saw this entourage come." Right. So I do think there's also that sense of there's still that apoliticalness within Singaporeans, right? Where especially for the non-key cabinet positions, they don't have a clear idea of who this MP is, but they're just like, oh, this is an MP, let me shake his hand, or let me take a selfie, and then let me carry on with my day.
Right.
But I think President Taman is a very interesting example because when he was running his president election, after he won, the celebratory location is actually at Taman Jurong Hawker Center.
Right.
And then they filled like 2-3 stories, and then they were shouting like "Ong Lai, Ong Lai" after he won, right? And I guess that symbolizes the power, lah. If the politician is indeed a very strong candidate, then I think that is where the mass of the support is, lah, at the hawker center.
I think that's a good point. So the barometer of a politician's popularity, right? Before the election itself, we see how well they are received at the hawker centers, right? Because that is the heart of the neighborhood, right? So yes, I mean I definitely agree with Taman. I think Taman, any room he comes into, like people will be quite excited, right? I remember ESM Go saying in the early years of his premiership, he said that when he went to Hougang, in the hawker centers, people didn't want to shake his hand. So it was only later on in the other elections that people did. And imagine that was a prime minister, so because that's the opposition bastion, right? So it's very fascinating. I guess in the upcoming elections during the hustings, I'll spend more time at the hawker centers. I genuinely mean this. I genuinely mean this. And also, Feng Shan, the market there, the hawker center, the Workers' Party always goes there. I mean, that's like their port as well. So it goes both ways. It's not just the PAP, right? The opposition also see this as a sign.
I think that's an interesting point because I do remember in was it 2015 or 2020? I think it's 2015 when Tan Cheng Bock left the PAP to start the PSP. I think he met Lee Hsien Loong's brother at Ang Mo Kio.
2020,
right? 2020, yes. And I think it is I think in that sense it's very intentional, the message that they're trying to send, like I'm trying to challenge Lee Hsien Loong's ward, or I'm trying to sort of stage a show here, right? And then it becomes a spectacle, right? The hawker center becomes a theater almost.
That particular episode I thought was so theatrical because he was passing the membership card or something, right? At the hawker center, and then listen, it seemed like he felt a bit awkward being in the hawker center. I don't know. It just felt a bit, the whole spectacle felt a bit off to me. But yeah, I've always wondered, right, how many of these politicians, right, without cameras actually do it at the hawker
Mm,
centers when the cameras are not on. I know some do. I don't know how many, and
mm,
it's almost impossible to find out also because they wouldn't be posting about it since the criteria is
mm,
without cameras, right? But yeah, I
yeah.
think I guess the point of me saying that is ordinary Singaporeans do this a lot because this is the other question I wanted to ask you. There is a class dimension here as well, right?
Mm,
So no doubt you said that the hawker center is an equalizer. I believe you quoted somebody. You quote Lily Kong or
mm.
someone where you said,
Lily
yeah,
Kong, yes.
yeah. So it's an equalizer, and I agree. But uh, there's equal and there's equal, right?
Yeah.
So there's still a class dimension there. Do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think definitely I think surprisingly is so there is definitely a class dimensions. I think the idea where so I think for example like for most Singaporeans who stay in HDBs, the hawker center is where you go every day for your daily food, right? But I do think for the richer upper echelons of Singapore society, where let's say you stay in a landed property and hawker centers are not available, then hawker centers almost becomes like a like entertainment, like a
Yeah, it's
game,
an
right?
outing, correct. Yeah,
It's
you're
an
right.
outing, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it's
as
a
that
family
oh,
outing, yeah.
I want to go to let's say you stay in Bukit Timah, like you have to intentionally make the trip to go to like Bedok 85, right? Yeah, and then it's like oh, then you have to plan to go to Bedok 85, almost like you're planning to go to some Michelin restaurant like that, right?
Right.
But I do think also in it's so maybe in a sense of habitus, right? The idea of like everyday living, it is quite different. But I think when I think Prof. Lee Kong and when I started Prof. Lee Kong, I think the idea was that when these people reach the hawker centers, it is still quite equalizing, right? It's the idea that they have to sweat, they have to queue up, right? They have to get scolded or berated by the auntie or uncle that's always very annoyed. They have to sit on the same public chair. So when they enter the hawker centers, especially the hawker centers, it is equalized in that sense, right? But yes, I do agree that there is an equal and unequal dimension for, I guess, in the habitats or the social life or the everyday life of different people.
Okay, okay. Thank
Yeah.
you. So what if you were advising the PAP now, right?
Oh, wow.
What do you
Oh, very big words. No, no,
what
no. I
what
wouldn't
would
dare.
well, okay, who endorsed your book, right? So you're not too far off. So what would you say to them about hawker centers?
So I think for me it's the idea that they should be a little bit more, I guess, more public with the idea that hawker centers are indeed do have that social element to it, right? I think thus far, NEA's perspective and NEA's, I guess, their responses to parliamentary questions has always been more of an operational procedural role. Like it's the idea that they are there to facilitate clean hawker centers, new hawker centers. They're there to process the hawker licenses, so on and so forth. But I think there needs to be a little bit. I guess it's also good for the PAP to recognize that hawker centers do have that social dimension, right? At least more publicly. I remember reading an article once by DPM, or I think someone quoted DPM Taman about how how cheap food is essential for Singapore because it keeps wages low, right? And I think more recognition in that sort of vein is important, right? Because then it shows that the government is aware that hawker centers are a key instrument where they are monitoring, especially when it comes to social economic policies, right? Then it shows that the government is indeed trying to subsidize a lot of of the hawkers operations, right? And I think it's not difficult, right? For example, you can easily publish, an average hawker rent of the hawker center. Let's say the Marine Parade, right?
Yeah.
For example, you can easily publish the average hawker rent of a Marine Parade hawker center store and the coffee shop surrounding it, right? And
Mm,
then it's not difficult to see how much the government is subsidizing
right.
per store, and how much the government is implicitly paying, right? Right.
Mm,
Either by land subsidies or land costs or by like rent, right? Because it's almost as I think the way I see it's in terms of land, it's almost as clear as like HDBs and private condos. I
Right.
think the rent premium for coffee shops, for private food courts are just that stark, right? But the data is not public, right? And I think I don't know if there's an aversion to it being there, right? I think there's also risks where if you do release the kind of data, the idea that now that let's say the average rent is 1,000 to 1,005, then there's no wiggle room for the government,
Yeah.
right? And I guess that's a valid concern, but
Right.
I do
Right.
think it was. I think in the new vein where PM Lawrence Wong is trying to move into, the idea that we are more social, more equitable, more caring society, I think we do have that room for that. That we can recognize that it's some form of a food program almost,
Right.
um, and to be more explicit with that. I don't think there's any harm in being a little bit more explicit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That was good. So just one final question, right? So
Mm,
you talk a lot about the hawker center being a multicultural, multiracial space, right?
mm,
Um, do you see this a lot in your own interactions at the hawker
mm,
center, or is it that you have Malays, you have Indians, you have Chinese, but they are all
mm,
in their silos, they're all sitting in, and there is not much interaction. There's passing by, there's seeing,
mm,
there's not even waving or talking. Which one do you see?
mm. I think both. uh, I would say, in a good way and a bad. I think fortunately and unfortunately both, right? I do think, like for example, when I go to the hawker center with my grandmother, I think that kind of organic interaction between the different races is very prominent, right? She can speak Bahasa, she can speak Malay to the
Yeah,
Malay makcik when she's buying her
right,
stuff, and then she knows everybody around there. The idea of that old
right,
kampong spirit really still
right, right.
exists, and you can see it being performed at the hawker center. I do think for the younger generations it's a little bit more siloed, right? And um, I think that also perhaps speaks to the different kind of mentality or towards social interactions, right, in the younger generations.
Yeah,
Right, like for example, me, like for my friends and I, yeah, we I think even when we have different races, like when we grow up in like one Chinese, one Malay, one Indian, right? I think going to hawker center it's very easy for us because there's no need to worry about like going to a halal
right,
restaurant or
right, right, right.
going and I go there, everybody can have different types of food, right? But I do think that sense of organic interaction across races is changing, right? And I'm not too sure why. I think perhaps you might know better than me about this, or maybe you can ask Prof. Teo Yan about this, or some of the other. But maybe Prof. Fabik, I think he will have some great
Yeah.
insights about this.
You know,
Yeah,
I mean, you are Gen Z or Gen
I'm
Z-ish?
1997, so I think
Okay.
half it,
Yeah.
half
So,
lah. Yeah,
so the younger ones, even those younger than you, right? Even within their own races, they rarely ever communicate with strangers, right?
yeah,
Let alone
yeah,
with us. So
yeah,
I think the problem, there is that problem, but I don't think it's a racial problem per se. I think it's more of
yeah,
a lack of social interaction
yeah.
problem.
But
Uh,
I do
but
think we have different cultures also. Like for my friends and I, like for me and my non-Chinese friends, we prefer to go to like those uh 24-hour Indian Muslim shops, right? Late
right,
night.
right,
I think when you're younger, you go to
yeah,
places that are 24 hours. The idea of prata as a supper food, I think that is a new culture. So I do think there is some, like, I don't want to say compensation, but some new ways of where you can see this multiracial, multicultural sort of ethnic sharing, if you will, right, in terms of social relations or in terms of like appreciation of food. And yeah, I think that dimension is changing. It may not be the same as the older generation through the hawker center, but I think it still exists, right? And there are always pockets of space in Singapore. I think that's always quite encouraging. Yeah.
okay. On that positive note, thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate this. And please, everyone, get this book.
And
It is, how much is it, the soft cover?
the soft cover is I think 28 before GST. So
Okay,
but
so
now
that
GST is 9%, so it's a bit more.
9%. That doesn't just affect hawker food,
Yeah.
it affects hawker books as well. So please get it. It's still very affordable. So thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Ryan, and all the best
Thank you.
with
Thank
your
you.
second book.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Good night.
Walid. Thanks for
Bye.
having me.
Bye.